Hello and welcome to A Baker's Passion. I'm Ray Madursky, and today I'm going to be demonstrating how to make sticky buns. The family recipe that I actually use for this is one that we call Philadelphia sticky buns. I don't know why that name came in my family, because this recipe actually goes back to Budapest, and it came in 1885 with my great-great-grandmother. So it's copied from my grandmother's handwritten version, and it's absolutely amazing. The cake part of the sticky buns is actually very close to what we would call brioche, but the Polish, the Czech, the Hungarian people all made a very rich sweet bread, a sweet yeast dough, and the Polish call it babka. Everyone has a name for it. And this is a dough that's very, very close to what the French call brioche. In fact, the technique that we're going to use to make this involves making what's called a sponge. And the Polish bakers actually taught French bakers, when they came to work for the wealthy families, how to make something called a pouliche. If you've ever seen that in a recipe, it's named in honor of Polish bakers, and it's a pre-ferment. So what we're going to make, I tend to use the easier terminology, it's a sponge, and what we do is mix the liquid, some flour, and the yeast with a little bit of something to kind of kick the yeast and get it going, and that's our pre-ferment. The reason for doing this is that the yeast is allowed to develop, and it develops more than it would by just making a normal dough the way we would if we were making a loaf of bread, so you get much more depth of flavor. Okay, so let's get going, and this video marks our first venture in the video series to actually get into making a yeast dough. So here we go. Now we're going to prepare the sponge, which is the first part of making the brioche-like dough. And what I've done is I've weighed the water and the powdered milk. Reason for the powdered milk is that it's easier to use with yeast than fresh milk. If you do use fresh milk, which you're certainly welcome to do, you would take the weight of the powdered milk plus the weight of the water and use that amount of milk. But you have to bring the milk to a simmer, turn it off, and allow it to cool to about 110, 115 degrees. Okay, I have added the honey and the malted barley. Malted barley is something I always use, and I really urge you to use it. I buy it at a natural food store, and it has something called diastatic amylase in it. This diastatic amylase, it's just an enzyme that breaks the starch into the monosaccharide sugar components. The monosaccharide sugars are the only form of sugar that yeast can actually eat. So you have monosaccharides, disaccharides. The sugar weed as table sugar is a disaccharide. And then you have starches, which are complex saccharides, complex sugars, basically. Well, the diastatic amylase helps the starch to break down into the small units which yeast can handle. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the yeast to the liquid. And then once it's sat 10 minutes, and I know that the yeast is good, then we will add flour to the sponge. Okay? So I'm going to add the yeast. And we're just going to allow it to rest now to make sure that it proofs. I do stir the yeast just to make sure it's all moistened. Okay, it's been 12 minutes and you can see what the mixture with the milk, the water, the honey, the malted barley, and the yeast looks like. So my yeast is good. I have a small amount. The total flour in the recipe, it's actually 5 ounces weighed. And this is bread flour, which is important. It's a higher protein content. And for all breads, whenever I'm doing yeast, there's only a few exceptions when I don't use bread, but I use bread flour for everything that I do with yeast. And you can see, just mixing it into a paste, and now it's going to sit and do some proofing. So now I have the weighed flour, sugar, and the measured salt in the mixing bowl, and I'm going to mix it just to get everything blended for about 30 seconds on low speed with the paddle attachment. I have my dough hook ready to go, but we're going to begin with the paddle. Okay, now we're going to add the sponge, the 4 eggs, and the butter all at the beginning. We'll work the dough with the paddle, then we'll remove the paddle and we'll knead with the dough hook. So here is the sponge. I'm going to add it to the mixing bowl. Okay, and now I have my 5 cold eggs. Beat them lightly and just put them right into the bowl. Now beat the batter, the dough, on low speed. Now I'm going to add the butter. Just putting the dough hook on. And we're just going to let it work till the dough comes together. It'll be about 14 to 15 minutes. This is how it looks in the beginning. Eventually the dough will form a mass. You can see how the dough is coming together. It's almost ready. It's been kneading for about 12 minutes. Okay, the mixer is on speed 4. I'm now lowering it to speed number 2. I'm going to let the dough work just a few more minutes, and then we'll be ready to do some hand kneading. Okay. Our dough is now ready to be kneaded for about 2 minutes by hand. You can see the structure is just wonderful. It's elastic, and that's what we want. We use the bread flour because it's high protein, i.e. gluten, and it gives structure to the yeast dough. Okay, so let's go and we'll knead by hand. Okay, so I'm going to work the dough now by hand, and this is actually a pretty important technique if you've never made bread. You want to watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the heel of my hands, push into the dough, turn it quarter of a turn, bring it back on itself, and we're just going to work it for about a minute or 2 like this, and then I'll show you how to tell when the dough is properly kneaded and ready to begin resting and fermenting. Okay, The dough has a beautiful smooth texture, and if we break a piece of it, we can actually just gently stretch it and it doesn't break. This is actually called the window pane test. Okay, so there we go. Now we're going to place it into a bowl that has been lightly oiled, and it'll grow until it probably increases 2.5 times its size. Then I will degas the dough, deflate it, punch it down, whatever you want to call it, and then it'll be refrigerated overnight, and we'll finish making the Philadelphia sticky buns tomorrow. Okay, so I've placed the dough in a bowl. It's been lightly oiled, as I said, and I just turn the dough over to give it a coating completely so that it doesn't dry out. Now I'll cover the bowl with 2 pieces of plastic wrap and just allow the dough to ferment. Okay, so the dough, has been fermenting for exactly 2 hours, and it's almost 3 times the size it was. We're going to deflate it. Some people call it punching down, but I call it deflating. And all we do is let the carbon dioxide release itself from the dough. Give the dough a turn in the bowl, and now I'm putting the dough into the refrigerator overnight. Okay, so the dough needs about 8-9 hours of refrigeration, and then we'll make our sticky buns.